Good morning. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education at the National First Ladies Library at the National First Ladies Historic Site in Canton, Ohio, and I want to welcome you to this morning's Legacy Lecture. Before we get things started, I want to let you know that we are broadcasting today on Zoom as well as Facebook Live. If you have questions, if you have issues hearing or with your audio visual throughout the program, please let us know in the chat as well as sharing your questions for the speaker this morning. So before we get things started, I wanted to mention some upcoming programs. So every month, the First Ladies Library does a legacy lecture program. It's usually the first Wednesday of the month, but next month we're starting early because of the upcoming election. So on November 2nd, you can join us for We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the ERA. We're really excited about this talk by Dr. Sook related to the Equal Rights Amendment, and she'll also be talking about the First Ladies and their views about the Equal Rights Amendment. So we've spent a lot of time talking about suffrage. We're excited to take that into the future and continue the talk of the Equal Rights Amendment and how it impacted history. We also have, if you have grandchildren or children at home, a program called Ladies in the Lab. It's a STEAM activity kit that you can order through our Eventbrite page online throughout each month. There is a different woman scientist featured, and you get an activity and a packet with historic information about that woman into your home. So this coming month, we have Katherine Johnson and the women who created the Mars rover as well. And you can build your own drawing robot. So we're excited and looking forward to that. We also have a talk by Chris Woodyard, who is the author of Haunted Ohio, called Beyond the Veil, The Dark World of Victorian Mourning on October 28th at 10 a.m. And we have a really fun film discussion series that we do with the Stark Library. So if you have a Stark Library card, you can log on to Hoopla and check out the film This Changes Everything this month. And it's about women in Hollywood. You can also register through our Eventbrite site to get a login to watch it if you're out of state or you don't have a card. So we're excited about that. And we're going to be talking to Britt Cherick, who is the head of the Bachtel Film Fest in Akron, Ohio, about women in the film industry, especially the film industry local to us in Northeast Ohio. We also are doing a little field trip next month inspired by our exhibition at First Ladies Historic Site related to First Ladies and the campaign trail. We are going to go on the road and we're going to be talking to the librarians and graduate student John Mayer Mora King at Bowling Green State Library in their pop culture area. They have a really interesting collection of campaign pins, and we're going to be talking about gender and as it relates to First Ladies and campaign pins. So I'm super excited about that talk. And if you'd like to join our book club discussion group, we are going to be reading The Invention of Wings on November 19th. So there's plenty of time to pick up that book by Sue Monk-Kidd and get started reading it. So that is all of the programming we have going on in the next month or so. So if this is your first time attending one of our talks or programs, please take a look at our Facebook page on social media and check out some of the other things going on at First Ladies. If you're local to Canton, First Ladies Education Center is open to the public and we have some really great exhibitions up right now. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's speaker, Kim Kenney. Kim Kenney earned a Master's of Arts degree in History, Museum Studies, at the Cooperstown Graduate Program in New York. She became curator of the McKinley Presidential Library and Museum in 2001 and was promoted to executive director in 2019. She's authored 8 books, and her work has appeared in The Public Historian, White House History, The Repository, The Boston Globe, and Mused. Kim has appeared on The Daily Show, First Lady's Influence and Images, and Mysteries at the Museum. Her program, The 1918 Influenza Pandemic, was also featured on C-SPAN's series American History TV. And Kim is going to be talking about her most recent book today. So I'm going to turn off my camera and microphone and turn things over to Kim. Welcome, Kim.
Hello, I'm going to share my screen here. All right. So hello, everybody. I'm actually at my house right now, but I don't want you to think that the museum is closed. The museum is open. We are open Tuesdays through Saturdays, but our internet connection has been a little flaky on a couple of the meetings I've been in recently, and so I thought it would be better to be home. But the risk here is that my cats might join us, so we'll see. Kit Kat and Doodle should be asleep, last I checked, but if they come through, I apologize in advance. So yes, I have written 8 books, and each time I write a book, it surprises me. I always feel like the last one I write is it, but it turns out that writing books is kind of addictive, and I've kind of written one right after another. So I want to talk a little bit about how this one got started. Some of you may know that I believe, let's see, 2019, so last year, I co-authored a book called Stark County Food with Barb Abbott of Canton Food Tours. And what is happening right now in history, and has been happening for the past 10 years or so, is that we're digitizing more and more resources, so particularly newspaper accounts. And this has unlocked all kinds of history that was trapped on microfilm. So if you've ever done any research with microfilm, I hate it. It makes me motion sick, and I don't even get motion sick, you know, in a car or anything, but I can't stand using microfilm. And it's really hard to do research on microfilm because you have to know exactly what you're trying to find, like the exact date of what you're looking for. So trying to do research of just, you know, searching for names or certain events, you can't find it easily. So now there's so much more available. So I was researching grocery stores for my book with Barb. That was one of the chapters I was in charge of. And I discovered Amelia Richardson. And I kind of went down a rabbit hole that day. Her husband owned a grocery store in Massillon on Main Street, which is Lincoln Way today. That's why she came up in my search. And as I was reading about her and how she had killed her husband, I had to find out what happened. And so I just kept saving all the articles that I found in the order in which they appeared. And I needed to know what happened at her trial. I needed to know if she was guilty or not, and all of it. And it took me a couple of hours that I got sidetracked with this. And that's another thing about jobs like this. You know, you go down all these paths as you're trying to focus on one thing. So this is my favorite example of that. So after I found out everything that happened to her, I put it away. And I thought to myself, well, I actually said out loud to Amelia, I'm going to tell your story someday. I don't know how right now, but I promise you people will know what happened to you. And then I kept working on grocery stores and restaurants and the food book. So the food book was turned in, and I was in the car driving to New York with my husband, and we were going to visit our family. And out of the blue, I said, I think I should write a book about murder. And he said, are you crazy? Because you just turned in the food book. Like, I literally had just turned it in a few weeks earlier. And I said, well, I feel like that's the best way that I can tell Amelia's story. And there are some really other interesting cases. So I think it could actually be a really interesting book. So when I got home, I contacted my editor, and it turned out the History Press had this series called Murder and Mayhem. And I pitched the idea, and they accepted it. It was kind of interesting. They normally make you wait a year, but because I had a co-author, they said I would be sharing responsibilities for publicity, and so I could start early. So The series is usually called Murder and Mayhem, but when I turned in the manuscript, they said, you don't have any mayhem, this is all murder. So the book became Murder in Stark County. So there are 8 murders that I talk about in 8 different chapters. And today I'm going to talk to you about Amelia and Annie George. And the other ones, I think probably what happens in murders is that if you're local, you've probably heard about the triple hanging, and you probably have heard about Annie George. So on the cover of the book are the 3 murderers for the triple hanging. 2 of them killed one guy and 1 of them killed another guy. And then their cases kind of happened around the same time. And to make a grand statement, the Stark County courts decided that they would hang all 3 of them together. So that's what the book is actually about. I will tell you a little secret. This book only goes up to, I believe, 1913. So most of the murders are in the 19th century, and there's a reason for that. When we were working on the Stark County food book, we had too many words and we had to cut. And one of the things we cut completely was a chapter about saloons and bars. We were like, well, our book is about food, so let's get rid of drink. That'll be easy. So I told Barb, I said, your next book can be about all of that. She's done a lot of research about Prohibition and what was going on in Canton during the 1920s. Some of her food tour talks about some of that if you've been on one of her tours. So I'm leaving that for her. And so I wanted to stay away from the 1920s. So I didn't write about anything that could potentially conflict with a book that she might do in the future. So this is all about the 19th century. And one of the things that happens with murder, and I talk about this in the introduction, is that we are absolutely fascinated with it. And I feel a little bit guilty to say that this book was the most fun for me to write of all of the other 7. This one was the most fun. And I feel a little bit guilty because it's really terrible. But a lot of the reasoning, psychologists have talked about why are we fascinated with it, kind of made me feel a little bit better. There's nothing wrong with me. It turns out this is very common. So some of the questions that I raised in the beginning of the book to get you to think about this is why do all these grisly details of a murder capture our imagination? Why do the names of the victims seem to fade over time, but those killers' names become household names? And we remember different people who have committed these horrible crimes, but we often don't remember who the victims are. Why is it so popular in all of its forms? TV shows, movies, books, magazines. There's lots of podcasts about murder, and it's just growing in popularity. So lots of people have spent a lot of time thinking about why are we interested in all of this? And basically the answer is simple. It's normal and it's human nature. And some of the reasons include, we ask ourselves, why did they do it? Could I do that? Was there anything that could have prevented this from happening? And we're forced to sort of look at ourselves through this lens of these crimes. And we hope when we look at ourselves that we like what we see. As a species, we are very focused on good versus evil. That's at the very heart of true crime. Just because I wrote a book about murder, I don't consider myself a true crime writer. This is kind of a one-off thing for me. I'm not going down that path, I don't think. Maybe I will, but I don't think so. I'm a local history writer. But what we want to do is to try to find out why people do these things and what makes them tick. We don't think that we would ever commit murder, so we want to understand how somebody could possibly do that. So this struggle to understand evil and to know what it means to be good is sort of it's the main conflict when you look at fiction. Like that's what we write about. We explore this idea of good versus evil, man versus himself, man versus man, all of that stuff from high school English classes. And so when we look at true crime, it's that whole concept, but it's also in our backyards. These are real people who really died in places that we go to every day. And so all of that combined to become murder in Stark County. And there's also sort of this concept of, at least it wasn't me. If somebody had to die, at least it wasn't me. So the other kind of simple biology of it is that talking about murder is scary. It's fear that actually causes adrenaline, and it's a little bit addicting. It's the same idea if you like to ride roller coasters or you like to watch scary movies. It's that thing that you want to do, and you keep doing it and keep doing it. So that is the reason that all of these things that you see on the screen capture our imagination, and it's just continuing to grow. It started out as a dime store paperback industry, and it has grown to all kinds of mainstream shows and things. And I will say that when I was writing this book, I often heard NBC's Dateline voice in my head while I was writing it. So that was kind of fun. So the thing about Murder 2, and it's so sensational. And what you see here is from the repository on June 14th, 1880. And under coming events, so you see, there's high school commencement, there's the Democratic National Convention, and oh, yeah, there's a triple hanging at the jail. So this is actually in the calendar of events, that this is something that you can go and see. You couldn't actually see it, so a lot of the historical writings talk about how it was a public hanging, and it was public in the sense that it was inside the jail and people got tickets to it. So it wasn't like it didn't happen out on the square, but it was something that people could actually go and see. Most of it was reporters, but there were tickets available to other people too. So it was public, but not public. So the thing about this book is it's not very well illustrated. As you can imagine, people don't take pictures of murder in the 19th century, particularly before the camera is invented. So when we were working on the cover, a lot of the books in this series, they like to put actual mug shots on the cover. So that's what they said to me. Well, where are your mug shots? And I said, well, it's the 19th century. There's no mug shots. So the closest we could get were these portraits of the three triple hanging murderers. But the entire book was written from contemporary accounts. So in the historical record, in the newspapers, people wrote word for word what happened in the trial. It's a transcript of everything that happened. And in some of these eras, and we'll see this in the Annie George murder, different newspapers cover it differently. And so putting all of that together is really kind of a fun process. And I wanted to use contemporary accounts because that was sort of, I felt, the raw story of what was actually happening. And this is a little bit different from any of my other books. In local history, you don't worry about giving away too much. But in this particular context, I don't want to ruin it for you if you haven't read the book yet. So it's not about selling books. The Stark Library, you can borrow the book for free. So it's not that I want to sell books. I just don't want to ruin it for any of you who haven't read it yet. So I'm just going to briefly start with the very first paragraph of the book, the first chapter, to just sort of set it up with our first murder. I approached to her bed cautiously, probably, without her being aware of it. I struck her with the flat side of an axe helve, a heavy blow on the side of the head and ear. I then took the infant from her breast and laid it in bed with the other children. And in his confession, written on November 14th, 1833, and published a week after his execution by hanging in the repository on November 29th, Christian Bachtel told the world exactly how he killed his wife in the early morning hours of April 2nd of that year. He continued, "As I took the babe from her, I heard her give a low moan or sigh, as though she were expiring, and I presumed she was senseless. But thinking it possible she was still sensible to suffering, I thought it would be an act of mercy to dispatch her at once. Accordingly, I struck her again with the sharp corner of the axe helve. With that final blow, Mary Henry Bachtel became Stark County's first murder victim, and her husband became its first murderer." So an axe helve, if you're not aware, is the handle. So he kind of bludgeoned her to death with the handle of the axe. And so this is in 1833. So Canton is founded in 1805, and we go a long time before we have our first murder. So of the two that I'm going to talk about today, we'll start with Amelia, and you'll notice in this, and it's the same clip that was on the earlier slide, she's called Emily on accident in the very first appearance of this crime. So after years of physical and mental abuse by her husband, Edward, she shot and killed him with a Smith & Wesson revolver on January 7th, 1876 at 24 West Main Street in Massillon. I already said they lived above the grocery store, which was on the first floor. So when the police came to her house, they found two victims. Edward was on the floor dead with a gunshot wound to his head. Amelia's throat was slit, and she had been shot in the side. She said, and she repeated this throughout to the witnesses that night, and it happened again throughout her trial. Her story was the same the whole time. She said she woke up and he was trying to slit her throat with a razor. She had a gun on her nightstand and she grabbed it. He got it away from her and shot her in the side. She wrestled it back and shot him in the head. That's what she said, and her story is consistent from beginning to end. So the state's case focused on statements that she made to witnesses that tried to raise questions about her version of events. They introduced Jacob Cryer as well, which they established as possibly someone that Amelia was having an affair with. The kind of big thing that the prosecution had against her was that there was a neighbor who reported hearing 2 gunshots 20 minutes apart. And because 20 minutes apart didn't jive with the story that she told, that was one of the kind of key things that they talked about, suggesting that possibly she had shot him and then maybe shot herself 20 minutes later in some kind of cover-up attempt. And the man who testified about that, they asked him, well, how do you know what time it was? He was up with a sick child. He had an old clock that chimed, and he thought that it was 20 minutes apart. So on the 7th day of the trial was my favorite part. So Dr. Theodore Wormley is called to the stand. And for 7 years, this man has been researching blood and its composition. So on page 34, this is the repository summarizing the details of Dr. Wormley's testimony. Here the sheet was produced that was found on Richardson's bed the morning of his death and identified as the one brought to Dr. Wormley's laboratory at Columbus on last Saturday by Mr. Day. The question involved was as to which side of the sheet the blood producing the spot frequently referred to before as being seen near the pillow on the south side of the bed was received. The doctor made evidence that he had carefully examined the spot on the sheet by aid of a microscope, and that in light of numerous results obtained by him in bringing cotton textures into opposition with fresh blood, gave it as his judgment that the blood on the sheet had been applied on the clotted side. Here, Mr. Day, one of the attorneys for the state, explained the manner in which the sheet had been found on the bed the morning of the tragedy, and showed to the jury that the clotted blood was found on the underside of the sheet. The doctor said it was possible to have applied the blood to the underside of the sheet by bringing it into contact with or dipping it in blood. He did not regard it as at all probable that the blood should have percolated through the sheet and coagulated on the underside. The doctor was requested to produce his microscope, and the blood spot was viewed through it by counsel and jury. The doctor testified that science had furnished no test by which the blood of one person could be distinguished from that of another, and that it would not be possible by examination to ascertain whether the blood found on the carpet and that found on the sheet belonged to the same or different persons. So I love this. In 1876, we can't tell one person's blood from another. There's no scientific way to do that. So Dr. Lorenzo Whiting, who's a local doctor, he was called to the stand next, and he talked about how if a woman has had children, that the skin on her side is pliable and could be drawn up in the hand. So basically, he's suggesting that she pulled the skin on her side of her stomach, shot herself, and then used that as a cover-up, that he didn't shoot, Edward didn't shoot her, she shot herself. There's also a lot of controversy that comes up on both sides concerning the eyes of the deceased. So some doctors say, Edward's eyes were closed when they found him. So some doctors are saying that your eyes are in the same state when you die as when you were killed. So easy way to say that, if you're asleep and someone kills you, your eyes will stay closed. If you're awake and somebody kills you, your eyes should stay open. So when it's Amelia's lawyers' turns, they refute all of these things. And one of the things that they get a doctor to say is that, you can't go by that there's all kinds of different reasons that people's eyes are open or closed. You can't say that just because his eyes were closed that he was killed while he was sleeping. So the defense called a string of witnesses to build a case of murder by self-defense. They had lots and lots of people testify about abuse that they had witnessed, either firsthand had seen him call her names. Redheaded bitch is one of the ones. And in the book, I say it exactly how it appears in the newspaper. They don't print that. They print B and then a big line and then an H. But all of the testimony of things that he said, there were just witness after witness after witness of what they had heard. They also had witnesses that talked about physical abuse that they had seen evidence of. So there was a couple of people who had, one person, I think, besides their daughter, who had seen physical abuse, but there were more people who had seen the result of the physical abuse. At one point, her nose had a really large gash in it. She had 2 black eyes, and her mother and a couple other people testified that she didn't know us, for a week. She was out of her head for a week. There was a former employee that said he got in between them once when Edward was trying to assault Amelia and ended up scratching her face in that altercation. The testimony of their daughter, Ella, who was a late teenager at the time, 17, 18 years old, was the hardest. She talked all about how she had seen abuse from her father to her mother her whole life. And that, I think, was the hardest to read, and it was the most detailed. So again, the medical experts are called to refute all of the prosecution's claims, including the blood theory. And the article that you see here is a tongue-in-cheek kind of account in the Stark County Democrat, talking about, if anybody in town any of the jury, they're now experts on blood, because blood has been talked about and re-talked about and examined and re-examined. And so now we are all experts on what blood there is. So the jury is told to deliberate on 3 different ideas. They can either find her guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or manslaughter. And in almost all of the cases, what the judge reports to the jury and the instructions that he gives them, that's written verbatim as well. So in all of these cases, it's the same definition, but this is the first time that you'll see it. So first-degree murder is murder committed deliberately and with premeditated malice. Second-degree murder is murder that's committed purposely and maliciously, but without premeditation and deliberation. So it's something that you didn't plan ahead of time. First-degree murder is plotted out. Second-degree murder is not plotted out, but you still do it on purpose, but you don't deliberate about it for weeks planning how you're going to do it. Manslaughter means that somebody was killed without malice. So this can happen either upon sudden quarrel or unintentionally. So, in the heat of the moment, you shoot somebody. That's manslaughter. So the jury is given the case. They deliberate all night. They come back at 8 in the morning on Sunday, happened to be Christmas Eve, I believe. The courthouse bells ring. That's a signal that the jury's back and everybody comes back to the courthouse. And Amelia is shocked to find out that she is found guilty of manslaughter. She was convinced that all of the string of witnesses that she had would prove that it was self-defense and that she'd been abused for her entire marriage. But the jury felt otherwise, and they convicted her of manslaughter. So she served 15 months before she was pardoned. And perhaps the strangest part of her story, I think, is that she lives to be 96 years old, and she is buried in the Massillon City Cemetery in a joint stone with her husband, Edward. So you can see, he died in 1876 because she killed him. And then she is buried there in the same stone in 1933. So a lot of questions come up in my mind to why would you do this? Why would you, all these years later, be buried in the same plot as the man who abused you and you killed? And I don't have an answer for that. Some of you may know that I do walking tours at West Lawn, next to the monument, next to the museum. There are lots of stones that raise all kinds of questions. And some of those stories they're lost to history. There's no account about why she would have decided that. Her name is also spelled wrong, 2 M's. So it's very confusing. But I went last summer after I needed to take a picture. I found this on Find a Grave, but I wanted to take my own picture. So I went to the Massillon City Cemetery last summer and I found Amelia. I left flowers for her. I did not acknowledge that Edward was even there. So I was just like, sorry, this is about Amelia. So that is Amelia's story. And the case in the book is far more detailed, lots more testimony of lots of different people. But again, I didn't want to ruin the story if you hadn't read the book. So our second murderer is Annie George. Everyone then and now knows that she did it. So on October 7th, 1898, President William McKinley's brother-in-law, so he's president at the time, is shot dead in the front yard of his widowed lover's home. And that house is at 319 Lincoln Avenue Northwest. And the house still stands. It's within, I would say, a 2-minute walk of the museum. It's a 2-minute walk from the place where he was killed to where George is buried today in West Lawn Cemetery. And this story gets very complicated. So Annie is immediately suspected as the murderer. And what's complicated about the story is that her name is Annie George, her husband's name is Sample George, and the person that was killed is George Saxton. So there's too many Georges in this story. So it's hard to keep them straight. So hopefully I will not misspeak and call one in a way that makes it confusing for you. So Annie is immediately suspected, and the story begins. So the murder happens in 1898. And I always felt bad for President McKinley. The dust is just settling from the Spanish-American War, and this scandal happened. So of course it's national news. The president's brother-in-law has been murdered. He is known as a womanizer in town. So he's not of the highest character, kind of a family embarrassment. And so when he is murdered, a lot of people aren't surprised. But the trouble starts 6 years earlier. So in 1892, Sample George, Annie's husband, sues George Saxton for alienation of affections because his wife has left him and their children and has left him for George Saxton. So the lawsuit said that she had abandoned him, and he was asking for $30,000. So think about $30,000 in 1892. It's outrageous, millions of dollars today. It's a lot of money. So naturally, Saxton denies the affair. He says that he's not having an affair with her. She's nothing more than a tenant in one of the buildings that he owns downtown. And that's the extent of their relationship. So this is what I was talking about when you get to have competing newspapers that talk about these different things. So the Stark County Democrat writes far more stories about this than the Repository does. So the Repository was founded by Ida McKinley's grandfather. So John Saxton founds the Repository in 1815. By the 1890s, the family doesn't own it anymore, but it's still kind of a family tradition, and they aren't really interested in poking too much at George Saxton. So the Stark County Democrat, no holds barred. They want to write all the sensational stories. So they covered it a lot better and a lot more interestingly than the Repository did at first. So at the time of this lawsuit in 1892, it comes out that Annie is in Dakota. So that's before North and South Dakota. It's just called Dakota. And she's there to get a divorce. And although she was from a poor family and she and Sample didn't have a lot of money, she appeared to have plenty of money while she was staying in a hotel and while the divorce was being processed. So it seemed to indicate that perhaps George Saxton was taking care of her. And the lawsuit ends up being dismissed. There's legal technicalities, and so the lawsuit is dismissed. So this is in 1892. In 1895, they appear in the courts again because Annie is suing him for return of her property. So sometime between 1892 and 1895, things go south with George Saxton and Annie George. And she claims that he has some of her property. I think there's some kind of eviction process that happens, and he's holding some of her stuff, and so she's suing him for it. In 1896, the following year, the Repository reports that all lawsuits related to the two are settled out of court, including a breach of contract case that Annie brought against him. She claimed that he promised to marry her after she got her divorce, but then he refused to follow through. So this is in 1896. By 1897, she's sending him threatening letters. He gets a restraining order against her, and then we see that Sample George's case is back in court. So he appealed it a few times, and it was thrown out, and then he appealed it, and eventually in 1897, the courts say they will hear the case. So this is the original alienation of affections case that he brought first in 1892. So 2 days after Sample George's case is settled, George Saxton is murdered. Neighbors report that they heard 4 or 5 gunshots. There was a streetcar driver that said that Annie had gotten off at Hazlitt Avenue. So Hazlitt, if you're familiar with that area of Canton, Hazlitt is the street that the monument, like the museum, is on. So it goes between 7th Street and Lincoln Way today. Lincoln Avenue is only a few blocks away. So the streetcar driver says, yes, before the time of the murder, not long, it was 15 minutes, 20 minutes before the murder, he dropped Annie off at Hazlitt. So Annie's arrested, and she refuses to say where she was at the time of the murder. She won't talk at all. She had a bunch of Spanish needles and burrs on her dress, and they asked her, why are those on your skirt? She wouldn't answer. There was a vacant lot near the house where George was killed, and the speculation was that she had run through that vacant lot and had gotten those Spanish needles and burrs on her skirt, but she won't talk about that. Mrs. Althouse, whose home it was, that's the widowed lover of George Saxton, said she couldn't understand what he was doing at her house because he knew that she wasn't home. She was caring for a sick family member and she wasn't there. And so she wasn't understanding why he was even at her house. So the speculation is that he was lured there by Annie. At the coroner's inquest, and that's kind of like a pre-trial sort of thing, it comes up that Annie, when she was arrested, they come up and they tell her that she's being arrested for murder. And she says, well, she doesn't say, what are you talking about? Who's the murderer? Or who's the victim? She doesn't defend herself. She just says, well. So people kind of look at that as sort of well, you know what you're being arrested for. You know who's dead. You know that you just shot him. She reportedly had said that if he didn't marry her, she would kill him, and that no jury on earth would convict me after hearing my story. So the preliminary hearing, her attorney said that there's no direct evidence linking her to the murder, but it goes to trial anyway. And here is an image of the house, and that's Annie on the left and Eva Althouse on the right. So it's Eva's house. So the trial starts on April 4th of 1899. Her lawyers try really hard to get it dismissed completely, but it goes to trial anyway. Interestingly enough, Mrs. Althouse cannot be located to testify, and she is not in contempt of court because she cannot be found to give a subpoena to. She is reportedly out of state, but because she's not in Ohio, they can't compel her to come home. They can't serve her with any paper, so she is out of the case. So the opening statement of this trial, let's see here. Based on the defense's opening statement, the article that appears in the Stark County Democrat dissected George Saxton's character, asserting that he was popular with women, but not exactly well-liked by men. And this is a quote. That he deliberately and systematically set about to wreck more families than one is confidently believed by many citizens of the city who knows his history, the article said. Scandals began to find their way among the people, and George Saxton became an outcast from society, ostracized by the circles that formerly knew him, avoided by former friends of the male sex, and shunned by good women who had formerly welcomed him to their homes. Annie was described as a beautiful, attractively shaped, big-hearted country woman. George was characterized as a spider who laid a trap for Annie, a fair butterfly. The article charged that he began to woo her with dresses and jewelry and told her that the only thing holding her back from being a society lady was her humble husband. So she left him for the, quote, well-bred landlord of the Saxton block. But her happiness was short-lived, as it was the same old tale with Saxton. He soon tired of her. Next came all the lawsuits. The article concluded with the non-committal notion that Annie's guilt would be proven or disproven as the trial progressed. So what happens in her trial is that her lawyers successfully argued to have key pieces of evidence against her dismissed. So that essentially weakens the state's case against her. So there are certain things that would really be damning to her that the jury's not allowed to hear. So for example, the judge ruled that the testimony that she refused to answer questions on the night she was arrested could not be used to prove her guilt. It's the same idea as that, you have the right to not appear in your court case, so you have the right to not be put on the stand, and that cannot be used as evidence of your guilt. So they decided that the judge in particular, decided that the fact that she didn't answer on her own behalf is that same idea. You're allowed to not speak, and it doesn't imply that you're guilty. There was also a chemical analysis of gunpowder that was done from the cuticles on one of her hands, probably her right hand. Then the doctor, it was a female doctor who came and took the sample. That was ruled that it couldn't be used in the court because she didn't consent to it voluntarily. Apparently, the sample was insufficient anyway, and the state was fine with the fact that they had other witnesses who sort of said that it looked to them like it was gunpowder. It smelled like gunpowder and looked like gunpowder, but the actual chemical analysis was thrown out. So there's lots more examples of things that would have been really, really great for the state's case that they couldn't use. But not all the decisions were in Annie's favor. One of those examples is that the judge did rule that her former attorney, who was one of the witnesses, he tried to say that he couldn't speak about their conversation because it was attorney-client privilege. And the judge ruled that when the conversation shifted to the contemplation of a crime, that confidentiality was no longer binding. And so that particular testimony was really not great for Annie. He said that Annie had said after Sample's lawsuit that there would either be a wedding or a funeral. So one of the witnesses who said that she saw a tall figure at the scene was discredited by Annie's attorneys as a morphine addict. And the court case is sort of hijacked by this whole idea that this woman who says she saw a figure, and she couldn't see a face, she didn't say who it was, but it's completely hijacked with all this testimony about what happens to somebody who's addicted to morphine, how they can't think straight, all of those types of things. And as a result, there is not one witness who clearly saw the murderer. The defense got one who said that he thought he saw a woman to admit that it could have been a woman or it could have been a man who was wearing women's clothes. So as you know, you're guilty until proven innocent, or innocent until proven guilty. And, it's up to the state's case, the state's attorney's case to prove that you did something. And it has to be beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's not like a civil case where it's different. When it's murder, if there's any doubt at all, you can't convict somebody. And so the way that her defense lawyers, they just poked holes in every single thing that the state brought up. In closing arguments, her attorney said that the jury must first decide that she killed him before considering any threats. So their theory was that the threats don't mean anything if you don't think that she killed him. And you can't say that she killed him if there's no witness that puts her at the scene of the crime in that moment. That's their argument. One of the things that they decided in their defense of her was that the streetcar was running late that day. So even though there was a witness that said she got off at Hazlet at such and such a time, they're claiming that night the streetcar was late and that the timeline doesn't make sense, that she couldn't possibly have gotten to the Lincoln Avenue house and killed him in the time frame that it happened because she didn't get off that streetcar until late. So in the closing arguments, and this is one of my favorite things in the whole book, the prosecutor says, "It is my deliberate judgment that the death of George D. Saxton was to Canton a public benefaction, that the air is purer by his passing, and our wives and sisters and daughters are safer because of his spirit taking its flight." So that's some pretty strong words. And in her lawyers, they repeat this idea that she's innocent until proven guilty. So her lawyer reminded the jury that Annie was innocent until proven guilty, and she was entitled to the benefit of every doubt. And so long as any of you have any doubt about any of the links in the chain, she must continue to be regarded as innocent. He portrayed Annie as someone who wanted to marry George, not kill him. He dismissed her threats as those made by an emotional woman who was desperately in love. She loved Saxton, he said. He had won her affection and her love completely, and she was devoted to him. She had no hatred for him, no reason to kill him, but a desire to live only for him and with him. Threats made under such circumstances were never made with the intention of executing them. So the jury deliberates for 24 hours, and they come back with a verdict of not guilty. And the courtroom erupts in cheers. Everyone in that room was on her side. George Saxton had a lot of enemies, and I think it's safe to say there weren't too many people, maybe beyond his family, that were sorry that he was killed. So I want to end with a quote from the Alliance Review after the fact. So this is after the case is done. The verdict of not guilty will be variously received, for the belief has been almost universal that she committed the deed. Equally general is the feeling that the man who was slain had given her extreme provocation. So that's why I say everyone then and everyone now knows she did it, but she just had some really great lawyering and ended up being not guilty. So I will stop sharing my screen now. And I don't know if there were any questions, Allison.
Sorry about that. We do have a few questions. First of all, I wanted to ask you, where can people buy the book? Where should they head?
You can come to the museum shop at the McKinley Presidential Library and Museum. And our members get a discount, so that's a good perk. But it's available also, wherever books are sold. If you're not local, you can get it on Amazon.
There was a question about Amelia Richardson's grave, and if you did any research on cemetery records related to who paid for the grave.
Oh, I did not. That's a really great avenue to maybe figure that out. Ella, their daughter, Ella died a few months before. So I'm not sure who was left at that point, who might have been in charge of that. We know that it couldn't have been Ella because she died before her mother. So that's a really good idea. I'll have to look that up.
Were there other women murderers in Stark County that you came upon during the 19th century, or were Amelia and Annie the only ones?
I believe Amelia and Annie were the only ones. There was a really interesting journal about court cases in Ohio, and it sort of listed all the murders in order. And so that was kind of my blueprint for the ones that I chose. There were 2 murders I was going to put in the book, but the book got too long. That happens to me all the time. So they got cut. But the only ones that I'm aware of were Amelia and Annie. Murder is generally something that men commit. So it's fairly unusual to have women murderers in general. There's far fewer throughout history.
I am so interested in the gender dynamics of the reception of Amelia and Annie. So Amelia is a battered woman. Annie was a woman who she had separated from her husband to pursue this relationship with George, and George did not, it left her high and dry, and the 2 cases were received really differently. I'm wondering if you could talk to those kinds of stereotypes of women and expectations culturally in the 19th century in relation to both of their cases.
It's very difficult as a woman to read the way that these things are received. So Annie, it has to do with the victims, I think, too. So Edward was a city council member. He was a well-respected businessman in town. So it was harder for people, I think, to believe that any of this had happened. Versus Annie and George Saxton, he was this womanizer. He had a bad reputation. Most people were glad that he was dead. And so she's received a lot differently. It's very interesting the way they talk about her too, and they don't really talk about Amelia's appearance at all in her accounts. But Annie is always, they talk about what she's wearing, that she has a jaunty hat on today, and she's got flowers on the witness, where she's sitting, she's got all these flowers all the time, and it's a very different way of looking at it. And I think it has to do with the victim. I think most of the time, I think that George Saxton is a unique case. I think most of the time women are not given the benefit of the doubt that this abuse did actually take place. So Amelia's court case, they're trying to drag her through the mud. They talk all about how she was abusive too. She called him names too. I mean, there's no evidence that she physically assaulted him except for the last night. All of the evidence points to the fact that he was hitting her, he was screaming at her. People knew it was happening, and nobody did anything about it. But because he's a prominent citizen, they side with him. And I think that the jury, I saw just a quick flash of a question. No, women were not permitted to be on juries in that time period. They were allowed to testify, but they were not part of the jury. So you're not going to get a fair trial of your peers if it's only men. That's a whole problem with women committing crimes until women are allowed to serve on juries.
Did the George Saxton case made national news when the murder happened, but I wondered if newspapers continued to cover the case.
I think they did continue to cover it. There was an agreement made that the McKinleys and Saxton families would not be dragged into the case. And there was some effort to try to streamline the case so that it would be quicker. And the Saxton family said, let it take as long as it needs to take. They tried to call Mary, so that was Ida's sister. They tried to call her to the stand because they wanted to know if there was any evidence in George Saxton's papers that this case had been settled, that Sample George had been paid by him. Mary was sick at the time, so her husband appeared in court on her behalf, and it was very brief testimony that there was no record in his papers of this payment to Sample George. But other than that, the judge was adamant. Like, even if the court case started to go off towards the McKinleys or towards the Saxtons, they weren't allowed to even bring that up. So there was some element of protecting the president's reputation in the local case. But yeah, I think the case was definitely nationally, people were paying attention. It's the president's brother-in-law, so it's going to be national news. And it's kind of sad. Ida was not well. Everybody knows that. And so McKinley was at a reception when somebody sort of came up to him and whispered in his ear that George had been killed. And it takes him several hours before he figures out how to tell Ida and to gently break it to her that her brother has been killed. So I love that part of the story as well, because it illustrates their marriage and how considerate he always was of her. That any news like that, he had to deliver it carefully and with a lot of thought. So that was really very sweet.
There's a few questions. They are not coming from the National First Ladies Library staff here in the chat about Ida. More questions. Did Ida make any public comment, and what was her relationship with George?
Ida did not make any public comment. I don't think the president did as well. The family, the Saxtons made comment after the fact, after he was found, or she was found innocent. They weren't happy with it. They wanted her to be convicted, and they believed that she killed him. I'm not entirely sure how to characterize Ida's relationship with George. I think he was somewhat estranged from the family based on his activities. They were a very prominent family in town, and I think the way that he conducted himself was not something they were particularly proud of. I wouldn't say they had disowned him. I don't think that there's evidence that they weren't speaking to him or anything like that. But I don't think they probably had a very close relationship based on the way he was living his life. But that's not something that I can really speak directly to.
Someone's asking, did you get any court records, or did you only use newspapers for your research?
I only used the newspapers because the proceedings were word for word, and there were a couple of times where I could compare the way things were covered, and I think for the most part it's accurate. It's of course not recorded, so it's a person's actual being in the court and taking notes about what was said, but I didn't actually go down to the courthouse and look at any records, no.
Did you find any more information on the female doctor that you talked about that did the chemical analysis? I thought that was really interesting.
Her name was Maria. I can't think of her last name. And no, I didn't go down that rabbit hole. It was here. This is Doodle. She's trying to get the paperclip. So thanks for joining us. But I didn't do any further research on her. No, she was one of very few female doctors, and she was called in specifically because it was a female who had been arrested. So that's why they wanted a female doctor, but that's very rare. in this time period.
Someone is asking, were there letters to the editors in the papers that gave insight to how the general population of Canton was feeling?
I don't know that there probably were. I can't say that I actually read any of them. But speaking of letters, there were a few letters that a reporter transcribed that were letters that George Saxton had written to Annie. But during the trial, it was not, they couldn't find the original. So the reporter was on the stand saying, I transcribed these letters, I saw them, I put it in the newspaper, but when they wanted to kind of trace it back to see if it was in his handwriting and all of that, they could not be located. But I think some of the editorials that were written or the editorializing that was done in the newspapers seemed to indicate the feeling of the community in general, because George Saxton was not well liked, and so there was a lot of people who were not sorry that he had died, unfortunately.
A lot more questions coming in pretty rapidly about George and Annie. So did the Georges ever get a formal divorce decree? Because Annie's statement regarding there being either a wedding or a funeral could have been directed at her husband.
No, they did get a divorce. So when she was in Dakota, that she was there to get a divorce, and she did get a divorce. So that statement was directed at the fact that, her lawyer had also said to her, she wanted to know about what should she wait? Basically, should she wait to pursue this until after Sample George's court case was finished with George Saxton? And her lawyer advised her, repeatedly, leave him alone. He has a restraining order against you. Like, you should leave him alone. But ultimately, he said to her, you should wait until afterwards before you make any kind of move on him one way or the other. So that was her plan, that she was going to wait until her ex-husband, got his settlement. He ended up with like $1,500 or something. He was suing for $30,000. And after the fact, it came out that he was already remarried. He had been remarried a year prior. So she was waiting for that to be settled. And once that was settled, she gave him an ultimatum, supposedly, that now, things are finished with my ex-husband. Now you need to make good on your promise to marry me. And he did not. And of course, we don't know what happened between them that night. The speculation is that she either probably sent him a note, maybe impersonating his, Mrs. Althouse, or I kind of doubt that he would have met Annie at night. It was dark at this time of day when they met. She had actually threatened him with a gun previously, and he kind of grabbed it out of her hand. So she had already threatened him. She had sent him many, many threatening letters. She had talked to other people about how he was either going to marry her or she was going to kill him. So I find it hard to believe that if she had said, meet me here, in the dark of night, that he would have gone. So I feel like there must have been some kind of ruse that got him to that location. And maybe she made one final demand. Like, this is in my mind, but I'm imagining. She made one final demand, like, are you going to marry me or not? And he said no, and she shot him. So, of course, we don't know what happened. And is it possible that it was some other person? Sure. He was not well liked, and it could have been someone else. And could anyone put her at the scene? No. There wasn't a gun. There was a whole other drama about the gun that's in the book. But, it's a situation where there were doubts, and you need to have, beyond a reasonable doubt. And because there were doubts, they could not convict her.
One thing I'm loving about this talk is how many people have theories in the chat and in the Q&A, both about the Saxton murder and especially Amelia's grave. There's someone mentioned that maybe it was a prepaid situation, and
it could have been
ended up that way.
Simple economics could have been the answer there.
So Kim, one last question for you. Do you have another book in the works? What are you planning? Are you taking a break?
I have a couple of other things. There's a really interesting series that I'm investigating about material culture, a topic told through objects. So I'm currently pursuing that. Other local history things, I think my next thing that I might pursue, I did an exhibit a couple years ago, well, my God, it's been 15 years now, called Letters Home, Stories from the Front. And it's about the exhibit was about soldiers and sailors who lived in Stark County who sent letters home. So it's not letters from home, it's letters home. And we've got some really, really interesting pieces from that exhibit. And I've always thought that would be a really great book. But because this book just came out this year, I have this 1 year waiting period. So I'm going to do something outside of the local history, hopefully, and then come back to that maybe in 2021 or 2022. I know it won't be my last. I know I've given up saying I'm not going to write another book because that's just never true. So there will be something. I'm not sure what the next thing will be, but there will be something eventually.
Well, Kim Kenney from the McKinley Museum, thank you so much for joining us to talk about your new book this morning. I'm
Thank
so
you.
glad that the cat got to make a cameo. That was a great surprise. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. If you tuned in late, you can connect with us on Facebook. We'll be sharing this and posting it to our YouTube page as well. So thank you so much, Kim. And please connect with National First Ladies Library online if you get a chance. And thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.